She said it's open-ended. So we have the freedom to kind of do what we want. So be thinking about what you might want to, so many options for cultural exploration. You know, every kind of cultural thing that you could observe probably has at least several uh uh like-minded cultural observances from other cultures. So any kind of rituals or music preferences or food types or whatever it would be that you are familiar with in your own culture, wherever, you know, whether it's American culture, Western culture, Southern culture, and so on, you could probably find an equivalent, though different, kind of thing that you could explore. So, you know, the mafia has a culture, organized crime has a culture, the way they go about things, the way they interact. Minorities have their culture and so on. So we'll be talking more about that next week. Uh, Cultural questionnaire is just for me to kind of, you know, like, way to say it, like, you know, feel you out without being too, you know, insensitive. Explore, you know, where you kind of come. Everybody in here has, without stepping outside of the classroom, multiple cultures that you identify with, right? Age, your sex, your socioeconomic status. Purview, well, college culture, higher education has a culture, an academic culture. Prairie View has its own specific form of that. That's similar to, you know, other schools, but different. The bigger the school, the more sports centered it is. They have that culture. There's all kinds of different ways that you can think about it. So it's open-ended. And so we'll be talking about possibilities as we um, progress. I have a question on that. One of the last ones. It's funny because it's like nudist culture. That's a whole thing. People go to these colonies and walk around with no clothes on, like it's normal. Like, I don't want to say natural because it is natural, but it's not customary. It's not something that we do in sort of tradition. So there must be a mindset, way of thinking about whatever. I don't know what it is. Not gonna get me. So, you know, and they're shameless about it. So it's not like, oh well, you know, it's only like find supermodels and muscle men out there. It's like everybody. So that's a different kind of cultural a way of interacting with each other. Um, so, but well, what's your opinion of that? I don't know the right. There's nothing right about it or wrong. It's just, and you might think about that in relationship, all kinds of other ways that, you know, like that, Comic-Con. You know what Comic-Con is? That kind of, it's a whole culture around it, like the way people dress and act and do things, even though if it's not yours. And we're going to talk about ethnocentrism in a second. That's where we're headed. Today, we're really mostly focused on the midterm reminder. I call it a reminder because it's really everything we've already done or said or been through. It's mostly just a vocabulary kind of quiz, or it's a variation on vocabulary. So the question might be, which of these is an example of? So, like, yeah, when Sykes does this, that's an example of whatever. And it's multiple choice. 25 questions, 25 questions, multiple choice. There are a lot more questions than 25, so they're taken from the group, randomized from groups. 7 in each group. But every single person will only encounter 25 questions. It is wrong thing. It will open tomorrow at 6 p.m. Technically, it's not due for you to take until 12:30 to say 2:30 on Thursday. That's your appointed time or whatever. But you haven't, like my online class has the whole range. Well, all my classes have the whole range of time from basically Thursday through Saturday to accomplish it. You won't need 2 hours, I doubt, very seriously. I don't think it took me 2 hours to make it, but you have the 2 hours because that's a typical midterm and final exam time range. We're not meeting as a class on Thursday. This is your assignment for Thursday. So technically you have that time to do it, although you don't have to do it at that time. If I understand that, right? And this is the page, whatever you want to call it, the word bank, uh, review sheet, whatever. Things in this light color, I don't know what color would that be, like a light purple, would probably call something else, are the things that are midterm, will be on the midterm. The others will save for the final or whatever. And then I put little initials by each one, and each initial, each set of initials references one of the stories. That's as a study guide help. It doesn't mean that it's going to appear that way. It's just to help you kind of understand a vocabulary word. You might think of it in relation to the characters that we explored. So we called, Nanameka, whatever, however you say it. He's pretty adamant about his love for Nene, Nini, whatever. Whereas Okiki is pretty adamant about his views about tradition and marriage, but he's also, we'll see later, obstinate, right? He refuses to budge. Adam just means that you're really strong in your opinion or your statement about whatever. Obstinate is pretty negative, like you're just, you're being kind of a hardhead about it. So I'm just going to go pretty much alphabetically through these. Like I said, some will appear as, it might say, it's all multiple choice. So to say, when Okiki states that he feels this way about marriage, he is being insistent. So therefore he's being, and then it'll have four choices, adamant. And I try very, very, very diligently to keep from putting like adamant and obstinate on the same choice. Right? So you wouldn't get confused with those, because like we have on here reprehensible, and then we have nefarious, and then we have incorrigible, all words kind of in the same area. So I try to keep those distinguishable as you take the multiple choice. Generally, my multiple choice questions will be four. You'll have two that are throwaways, that are silly, nonsense. One maybe way nonsense, like, I don't know, his unyielding opinion is an example of, I don't know, superhero powers, something goofy. And then you'll have another one that's kind of not goofy too. And then you'll have two that are reasonable, and one of those two is the right one. So let's see what we got here. Adversarial is not on the midterm. We'll talk about it, but an adversary is basically your enemy or an opponent, an antagonist. That's why I put the IC there. And as far as children, there's an adversarial relationship between the Chirulas and the grandfather, his power structure. Likewise with Sweat, between Elia and Sykes. Aesthetics, we didn't really touch upon that in any of the stories that we did. But it's important right now as a transitional word because as we do culture, we might be talking about aesthetics. Aesthetics have to do with sort of philosophical or have discussion of, but also interpretation of beauty. So in different cultures, beauty is the eye of the beholder, right? So back in like the Victorian age, like in the 1800s, if a woman was healthy, round with a lot of cush, whatever, that was considered the beauty standard, right? The aesthetic beauty standard. But then in the 20th century, skinny and fit became, especially like in the 1960s and 70s, right? Big around was the beauty standard for women, I'm talking. But that's all cultural differences. There is no right vision of aesthetics when it comes to your beauty and music or whatever. Talking about cultural differences with my humanities class, I'm touching upon music as a humanity, so we'll be talking about music, and music means different things to everybody, right? But everybody in here has some music, either style or performer or whatever, who touches you without your being able to define it or to encapsulate it in a cause state. So in that way, that music has an aesthetic quality, a beautiful quality. I mean, some music you might like because it's noisy, but it touches you in a different way. Maybe it makes you dance. Or aesthetics has to do with like cultural presentations, right? Illusion. I'm trying to think of a good illusion. Well, know who John Gruden is? Anybody? John Gruden is a professional football coach who is recently, like yesterday. Well, it's been ongoing, but yesterday he resigned because he was going to get forced out because he apparently sent out some very nasty email. Well, some email messages with very nasty sentiments regarding women and Black people and homosexuals and that. So now you know that. Illusions have to do with a common knowledge, right? So now you know who John Gruden is. So if I was to say, well, let's hope no matter how powerful and important you are in any profession, you'd be mindful of the kind of things you write in your messages to other people. I didn't say his name. I didn't say anything about the case, but because we would have that knowledge, I would be alluding to, making an allusion to. So if we looked at our stories that we read, you could maybe make arguments. You've already made your argument. Go back and say, well, that's a clear allusion to a biblical idea, and say like, if I get illusion. Talk about music again, a good example of an illusion. I couldn't think of a name. I don't know if it came up in our class, but it came up in classes. And if I were to tell you, I'm starting that Vadi song, start grow on. Now, if we have similar knowledge, a knowledge base, then your mind makes that connection. Summer Walker, right? Through just the song. And because we have the shared knowledge that it came up in a previous class, you would be able to understand my allusion, a reference to it without actually naming her or whatever. Ambiguity. We talked about that relationship to all the stories, basically. A good story oftentimes is ambiguous, has ambiguity, it's unclear, it's not certain. It doesn't beat us over the head with a message. We would call that didactic, by the way, word. You know, we're left wondering and able, and that's why we can interpret it. Kind of left with that open-ended, like, what are we supposed to feel about it? So the more ambiguity something has, the more freedom we have. You know, if I tell you that there's nothing ambiguous about Prairie View University, Prairie View's Department of Language and Communications, and Mr. Schmidt's syllabus that's ambiguous or has any ambiguity to it regarding plagiarism, right? Like plagiarizing, you're doing a very bad no-no. Those are not purple. Fuchsia, would that be fuchsia maybe? Lavender, yeah, that's a good one. Antagonist, and we'll see protagonist later. A protagonist is basically the main character of a story. Usually the good one or the one that we pull for because we feel certain positive sentiments. The antagonist can be a character or it can be an idea that opposes the protagonist, presents the conflict. So Sykes, use Sweat as our example, can be considered the antagonist, but also the world in which Sykes exists of men and sort of racial resentments, you know, abusive behavior. He could represent all that, but because ultimately that's what Delia has to stand up to, right? Get past it or overcome it. And he's sort of just the, you know, the embodiment of it. An article, a novel, short story, and nonfiction. Well, fiction and nonfiction. Fiction is fake, it's made up. It's lies, basically. As a writer myself, that's all I always thought about, making up people. Do made up things as a fictionist. Nonfiction is supposedly true, right? Or at least close to the truth. So a history book is supposed to be nonfiction. Gathers up as many true things and makes statements about it. Types of nonfiction are essays, nonfiction books, and articles. An article and an essay are very close. They're short compositions. Essays are short compositions that we do like in specific disciplines, like academics. Most of your academic writing would be essay writing, where it has a main idea and follows certain standards. Articles that you might read in a magazine or whatever don't have to follow all those standards. They can say whatever the hell they want. And you can believe them or not believe them. A novel is a typically long piece of typically fiction. There is a such thing as nonfiction novels, but they're rare. Basically, somebody writes a story, but they tell it like it's a piece of fiction, even though it's true. Like a memoir is a piece of nonfiction. It's not told in like an order and all that, necessarily. Different from a biography or an autobiography, which often follows some kind of chronological process. Everybody follow all that? Short stories, what we read, are short versions of novels. They're lies, they're made up, they're fiction, characters and plot and all that, that's made up. So just to clarify, because as I'm grading papers, people call Sweat a great novel, and it's not a novel. It's lengthwise, it's really not hard and fast, but it's somewhere between, I don't know, about 120 words is a small novel, a short novel. Somewhere between about 70 and 115 or whatever would be a novella. Fancy word for a short novel. Somewhere between a short story and a novel. And short stories could be anywhere from Well, we didn't read any really short ones, but I'm reading one with my class, my humanities class called Girl by Jamaica Kincaid. It's a paragraph. Is it a story? We'll be discussing. So that's what short stories are. Causal and articles. And causal is when you see a relationship between things that have some event that seems to bring about other events, or at least influence those events. Causal is just a fancy word that it has that kind of relationship, has a causal relationship. So we saw that in some of the stories, especially like the generational things where what parents do or what they experience kind of led to differences with how the new generation acts or reacts. Caveat. Caveat's a fancy word. I don't know how I came up, but it always comes up. A lot of people misuse caveat. I say to you, I'm going to give you an A for my course. The only caveat is that you do all your work. That's not really a warning. That's just a requirement. Caveat would be, you've been doing some great work. I'm going to give you an A in the course. Caveat is, unless I catch you cheating. Now, I'm giving you a warning to change your behavior. But it's not a warning like, like a policeman kind of one. It's a mild kind of, it's just a stipulation that has in it embedded the idea, I want you to do the right thing. Character is any person or personified essence or being in a story. It could be a fiction story, a nonfiction story, it doesn't matter. Whoever populates that story as people like beings. Climax is the top of that, where the conflict meets its worst moment. It's not on here, but there's a word, anticlimactic. Climactic is it gets to that place. It's like, now we're gonna fight. Anticlimactic is we're out in the parking lot. And the people are gathered around, you hit my car, whatever, and we're about to go to blows. Hey man, want to have a beer? Yeah, let's go. That's anticlimactic, right? Everybody's waiting for something big. I felt that way. I'm honest about it, but I felt that way about a contract overseas. I felt that by the time we got to the end, it's like, really? It kind of fizzled out a little bit for me. Coming of age stories. Anytime you have a young person who encounters things about life that changes their outlook or their perspective, consider it a coming of age story. And it's usually a universal theme, like, they have to encounter death, or they encounter corruption or power, or they realize things about their parents or their grandparents, i.e. as far as children, and maybe the shawl, where a young person has to grow, change. Condescend. I don't think you would understand that. I don't even know why I put it. You're not smart enough to get that, so we're just going to go past it. Just talking down to you, right? I don't think you can understand words. That language is a little different, but it's basically condescend. It's looking down upon somebody and trying to let them know you think they're inferior, right? So in relation to Warrior's children and Dee, probably condescend a lot to her mother, not so much to Maggie, because Maggie's a different kind of character, but conflict. Well, we know that's whatever's in front of the obstacle that's in front of the protagonist. It could be an actual thing, person, wall, whatever, or it could be an idea, concept. So, you could say the conflict, if you were really digging deep into, say, like as far as children or Sweat, you could say the power structure, that hierarchy that runs things. That's not a person, but everybody's everybody takes part in it, right? It's like systemic racism, right? It's not this one guy being racist or whatever. It's that it's like embedded in the way things are. So that would be an example of conflict that's very nuanced or complicated, I guess. The shawl, I have that up there as an example of marriage is a private affair because clearly the conflict arises out of a bigger thing than Okiki and the couple. Culture, well, that's where we're headed now. Culture is any, like I said, you can't have culture by yourself. You have to, it has to be a shared bunch of things with other people. So, I mean, you can have small cultures, you know, the chess club can have a culture, I don't know, 10 people or whatever. But it's the way you act, the rituals you do, the things you do, and sort of the why behind it. Dialogue. Let's have a dialogue. It means let's talk where we both, yeah. Right now, we're not having a dialogue, right? Not right now, I guess you could call it a lecture. When one person talks, we just call it monologue, right? Oneness. But typically when we talk about things in class, we're having a dialogue between us all. And when we see that rendered on page with quotation marks, it's dialogue. Side note, I'll come back to this. Short stories get quotation marks. Short anything get quotation marks. Articles, essays, songs, poems, unless it appears as its own publication, even a painting, quotation marks. My buddy here. Bigger things get italics. Nobody gets both. That would be excessive, redundant, and contradictory, I guess. I don't know about that. Diction is the way that any person, the way that any person conducts speech, written or oral, right? So, you know, when you go into different rhetorical situations, different environment, you may talk different, use more non-standard language around your friends or your family or whatever, and then you get the accompaniment of your religious colleagues or whatever, maybe differently. So diction makes its way through dialect in some of the stories that we read, right? How people talk. So we didn't talk about it here, but Shakespeare, you've all heard of Shakespeare, right? And when you have a Shakespearean play, you have these people that talk, they sound like they're talking funny. That's because they're talking in poetry. People back then didn't really talk in poetry. That was just theater. Specifically, like in Romeo and Juliet together speak in rhyming couplets. Romantic. So that's what diction is. Duplicitous. That's when you show one face for some people or to one person one time, and then you have a different face that you wear. Basically being a liar, a two-faced scoundrel, right? Sound like anybody we might know in any of the stories you read. Lying, two-faced scoundrel. Huh?
I'll do it with his name.
Sykes, yeah. Maybe Grandpa. Dada Jean. Depending on how you interpret him, but you know, he seems to us and to the little boy like a grandpa. Then he's got this other side, power, or whatever. You duplicitous son of a. Um, I'm not criticizing John Groot. He's a great football coach, but present yourself one way to the public, and then in your emails, you don't know if is going to get revealed, you're saying these kind of unpleasant things about people that you interact with. So you and I interacting, we have a conversation, and I go and I talk to somebody else about negative things about it. I'm being duplicitous, right? Decided in sort of a negative way. Epiphany. Aha! I even have that up here. Story, a lot of times characters in stories have epiphanies. They have a moment where they go, I see the world different. Sometimes it's implied, right? The narrator kind of implies it. So maybe the little boy in Ishwar's Children has an epiphany. He wouldn't call it that, he wouldn't know the word, but it comes to him sort of cerebrally or whatever. Grandpa is probably not wonderful as I thought he was. That makes for coming of age stories. Because you're all old enough to know the world is not as wonderful as you thought it was when you were 10, right? For whatever reasons. All those things that create conflicts in stories. We already talked about an essay. You pretty much should know what an essay is because that's what you're required to write for us. Ethnocentrism is kind of what happens in some of these stories. The marriage is a private affair. The culture between the big city, the cosmopolitan, and the culture between the village or the small town traditional way. That's you could say, oh, Kiki has a certain level of ethnocentrism. And now, not to let the cosmopolitan, because cosmopolitan by its very definition of nature would mean accepting of all cultures. But then again, a lot of times, like D in everyday use, accepts it, but kind of looks down upon it a little bit, right? He wants to hang quotes on the wall because they're quaint, whereas real folks want to cover up. Form. Ethnocentrism will tie into the last thing, which is xenophobia, which is kind of ethnocentrism taken to a inflammatory or a hostile place. Foreshadowing, we talked about that. Examples would be the clothes hamper, the bullwhip, sweat. In a way, Saul operates fully on foreshadow because it's headed toward the whole time we're hearing this one story, it's headed toward the second story. It gets us that way, we have to piece it together. So, you think about a foreshadow, when the shadows are, the lights behind you, the shadows in front of you, it's announcing your coming or your arrival before you actually get there. Incorrigible. Now, incorrigible doesn't mean bad. It means bad to the extent of not being redeemable. So you have some kind of like Hannibal Lecter or somebody like that crazy serial killing monster, and you throw him in jail, and there's just no fix. Right? Michael Myers is incorrigibly evil. Anybody a fan of the Halloween movies? I'm not either, but my wife and my daughter like to they make a ritual out of it every Halloween. I get mad at it because I'm a dude and I'm like, fuck. But then you realize, well, there's not anybody can't kill black and white. Irony. We saw lots of irony in a few of the stories. I guess there's subtle forms of irony, like in everyday use. She wants those quilts so much because they're status symbols, right? It's cute, it's quaint to take old stuff. Somebody, what's the word that when you go to like,
Vintage,
huh?
vintage.
Vintage, that's a good word. Like, vintage means old and but with different kind of quality or different kind of prestige. So I guess the irony is that she doesn't see the real value. That's a subtle form of irony, as opposed to the irony like in Sweat, where he plants making of his own death. Right out there for him to run into. I'm probably giving away one of the answers, the questions that match. We didn't talk about it all right. That match that we see early in the story when he's striking him on his pant leg or whatever, and then later we see the burnt match. Those are all foreshadowing, but it's also examples of irony. He's laying it out for himself. Marginalize. I don't think we really use that word in talking about some of the stories, but the Chiruas in Ishwar's Children probably would be considered a marginalized. I mean, it's a different culture and all, but still, that's a group of people pushed to the fringes. That's their language, to the sides. And although it's not up here, it's generally to consider them of a lesser importance or relevance in the bigger society. So a marginalized group, anybody who's, I think they use the dominant culture, doesn't let them in or whatever. So think about a piece of paper. Now I'm going to push you over to that side. Main side of the page is mine, right? Right in the middle. So whatever, the margins. The shawl would have the Native Americans or the First Tribes people. A lot of the conflict is not just what we see in the story, but it's the backdrop. People who are oppressed, probably marginalized, thought of as less important, or that's really not a nice way to think about it, but less relevant. Arius didn't really come up, but we can say that it's a great word for somebody like Sykes, right? Just wicked, absolutely wicked. No sense of good or whatever. I mean, you can use it as an adjective to describe actions too, right? So you come home and find your boyfriend or your girlfriend with somebody else. That was nefarious behavior because I trusted you. You're very duplicitous. Like a whole paragraph with these words. Nonchalant. If somebody came up to you behind you for no reason, they don't know you at all, they just walked up behind you and shot you in the back of the head with a weapon and just continued on like nothing happened. You might say that they're nonchalant or being so nonchalant, non-caring, don't seem to have any kind of emotional connection. That would be a nefarious act because of their nonchalance, right? There's a famous novel by a French writer where he kills this dude, this Arab dude on a beach, right? And then he's under investigation and all this, but they don't convict him or anything of that. But they ask him about his mother's death. He says he doesn't really. But his nonchalance about his mother's death is really what makes them convict him. Although we talked about that, obstinate, I talked about that. Think adamant, but adamant to the point of being like obnoxious, aggressive, or plain stupid, right? Don't be so obstinate. Probably could think of your interactions with people, and I found somebody to be obstinate. Officious. I threw that word out. It was up on the board, but we didn't really talk about it when I was doing the adjectives for characters, right? And I thought of D is kind of officious, Wangaro, but I really thought of the grandfather in Ishwar's Children, objectionably aggressive in offering his You probably know people like that, right? Let me help you out there. Let me show you how to do that. Kind of like mansplaining. You all know mansplaining? It's just an obnoxious way to intrude on somebody else's kind of private space or whatever. You all know oxymorons? That's when you don't, I made this joke in my early class, when you don't properly know how to use Tide deodorant, Tide detergent. Oxymoron. It's not on the midterm, but it basically means when you have something like jumbo shrimp, you have two opposing ideas or whatever. We'll see it for the midterm. Patriarchy. Patriarchal has to do with man-controlled societies. If you did something with sweat, you might have talked about that. You do something with children, that would have probably come up. Maybe the shawl a little bit, but that's a whole deeper thing because, well, you all know what emasculation is. You said, yeah. You want to define it for us?
A masculine person, so inferior and like, hey, I'm just saying, like, that's the thing that men are the head of the household. Like, if they don't have a job and you're making more than them, they consider emasculated. And they're like, they're the ones like cleaning up, are the ones women doing, they will feel emasculated.
Right. I mean, technically, it has to do with cutting off parts of the body that provide men with testosterone, right? But metaphorically, it's like robbing them of their sense of worth, all that. So in a way, you could think that in a patriarchal society, somebody like Sykes feels emasculated, both by the racial oppression of the time and that his woman, his property, is much dissing him or whatever. Again, I'm not trying to let Sykes have a free day or whatever. Plot, that's simply the events of a story as they're laid out. Posterity, look behind you. Everybody look behind you. Your posterior is that thing back there, right? Your mom's gonna whip you in your posterior, whip your butt, but it means behind. So posterior, when we use it in that bigger sense of leaving something behind, means really in the future. Right? So if you leave it for posterity, you're leaving it for children to come after you or generations to come after you. And so that story, I mean, that word might have fit well with everyday use, which is up there, but also as far as children and the shawl, where generational behaviors affect, have a causal relationship with others down the road. Precarious. Because short stories rely on conflict a lot, all these stories have people in precarious situations, kind of dangerous, unknown for whatever reasons. It could be societal, like in the shawl, where they live in this hostile kind of environment. Clearly, in a real, practical, true, tangible sense, without getting metaphorical or whatever, Delia is in a precarious situation because he's trying to kill her. She might not. She doesn't see the irony. By the way, we see the irony. You might see it in retrospect, look back at it. But as it's happening, it's like she's in danger. Precarious. It doesn't exactly mean the same as dangerous. I don't know if danger's up there, but it could be dangerous. You go walking down a dark street or through a dark cemetery, you might say that's a precarious, not because of ghosts and ghouls, but because of some bad person hiding behind a gravestone or whatever, ready to take your wallet from you or your life. I don't. Project, not project, project means to foist upon somebody else. A little bit, you all know gaslighting. Well, sociopaths do this a lot. Gaslight, like if you accuse me of something, say you accuse me of cheating you out of your money. I understand, but why did you let me have access to it? Why did you leave your wallet open for me? The gaslighting means you turn it around. I try to make you think you're crazy. You're the guilty one. You made me steal your money, right? So, if you accuse me of that, I go, well, you've stolen things too, and I bet you've stolen from me. Now I'm projecting, putting on you. I think it says throw or something.
I did manipulate somewhere. Manipulate somewhere.
Gaslighting or project?
Whatever example you were saying, basically, and you're like manipulating somebody.
Yeah. It's a sociopathic thing to do to other people. Yeah. To manipulate them. It's kind of classic husband-wife thing back in the day. You know, you catch your husband cheating and he claims it like you. You don't give me enough love. And you're always yelling at me. I need to. If you see fences, talk a lot about fences because you watch. Boy, the main character does this a lot. I need to go see birds. Not birds. I don't remember her name, but I need to go see her because she makes me feel good. And I don't feel as trapped as I do when I'm home, which implies I'm manipulating, making you feel. Of course, if you see fences, she turns it around on him. Protagonists, we already talked about that, the main character of a story. Reprehensible is a way to say really bad and worthy of getting fussed at or punished or whatever. So Sykes acts in many reprehensible ways, right? Think about things in society that when we hold people accountable for, I don't know, politicians stealing our tax money that was supposed to go to like helping children's medical issues. That's reprehensible. That's actually stealing. That's right. So, deserving of reproof. All those are fancy words, basically mean getting seriously fussed at or punished. So, in society with police bad behavior, I mean, all police probably bad sometimes, but if they're really bad, shooting somebody in the back or whatever, that's reprehensible. Rhetorical situation, really important for us in a writing atmosphere. I talked about articles and essays. Our rhetorical situation is an academic environment, so you write academic essays, which requires that you use a certain diction, a certain choice of words, phrases, and all that. So you, the writer, whoever the reader, and whatever your topic is, that's the rhetorical situation. And it relies upon ethos, pathos, and logos, my connection, your connection with me as a human being with the same values, and so I trust you. Your connection to me with the same emotional connections. So I know you are a human and have a heart, and both of our connection with whatever the facts are. Setting, time and place. A lot of times people, when they talk about, when you take a literature class, you press your instructions, say, teacher, a lot of times people don't place enough emphasis on the importance of setting the story. Setting oftentimes is really important because the story couldn't have taken place in other settings, in other times or other places. A different story could, but not the same kind of story. Symbolism. Well, you all know that. I mean, a lot of times in real life, we think something is symbolic of, it represents something bigger or deeper. So I don't know if it was this class, but I talked about walking on the grass, my first semester here. Well, you know, you walk on the grass, you don't overturn anybody's grave, you don't do anything really actual, except you violate the symbolic, deeper kind of underline, and then that's a pun. You know, the more profound idea of more than just grass and sidewalks or whatever. So symbolic actions and stories can be either, usually they're things, you know, obvious actual things, a bullwhip, perhaps a black umbrella, I showed it, those kinds of things. But they can be actions as well. So like the fight that the kid has with the father in the shawl could be seen as symbolic of some bigger thing. Beam, of course, that's the most important thing that everything has to relate to. Symbols have to relate to it, the foreshadowing has to relate to it, the plot has to relate to it, whatever the bigger message, and that's interpretive, and we might disagree with about it, but it's still the important thing. Thesis, that's important for essay writing, it's the main idea. And then the final one here is xenophobia. I'm not sure the origins of the word, but you all know phobia, right? Not here, but he kept saying we're talking about aesthetics. Classmate, I forget her name. Ayana? That's you. Can't remember. Anyway, she was talking about I don't know what the context was. In the African American community, there being, she kept saying fat. Is that a thing? That's terminology. So it's not really fear, it's more like, you know, like or a negative feeling about something. Xenophobia is that kind of thing toward foreigners, people that you feel don't belong in your group, whatever. And when we say foreigners, it could be like somebody from another country, but it could also be somebody from another state or, you know, another community, right? Somebody from a different culture moves into your neighborhood. Suddenly you feel like, you're gonna run the neighborhood because you're gonna have wild sex. That's those nudists I was talking about. Parts of the writing process. Easy, it's a three-parter. You just have a basic grasp of what they are. There's the pre-writing, the writing, and the post-writing. Break them down, it's coming up with ideas, formulating, generating the ideas, and then manipulating the ideas into some order, which would be the last one, the outlining. And then you actually sit down and you write sentences and paragraphs. That's your drafting stage. That can lead into the rewriting stage, which kind of laps over with proofing and editing, right? All of that can kind of happen at the same time, where you're looking at a document that you wrote and going, well, you know, it looks great, except now I need to check it for transitions and subject verb errors and stuff like that. Parts of an essay, I hope you know this by now, through me and through previous things, it's parts of the communication process. Intro, body, conclusion. They all serve different functions. You know, intro establishes what we're talking about, grabs you, tries to pull you in, lets you reader know what your main thoughts are, your thesis. Body presents the support for that. Details, discussion of whatever, and then finally your conclusion kind of wraps it all up. I think I say reviews, yeah, kind of goes back over some of the same things in a nutshell kind of fashion. And that's your review for the week.
We're not actually writing the essay.
No, just a multiple choice. Easy and speedy. what essay? Cultural analysis essay is not due until like week 11. So 2 weeks from next week. Other around Halloween. But we're gonna interact a lot. I have to put on my thinking goggles a little bit to figure out what can we. Maybe we'll talk about music and the effects that music has on us. I have a student in my humanities class talking, introduced me to well, you all know Marvin Gaye. What about Tammy Terrell? Marvin Gaye's, singing partner for a few albums. And this point was different, but talking about Motown. Everybody, all the Motown greats died in some horrific ways. Marvin Gaye's father, people died like killed by his friends or whatever. But his other point was that he was playing a Nat King Cole song for me. For like 20 minutes. That music takes him to different places. Like you listen to the song and suddenly, like maybe you're by a lake, cool breeze blowing, trees are swaying. Life seems calm and tranquil and all that. So we could talk about those kinds of things. What kind of music makes us do that? Doesn't necessarily have to be our favorite kind of music or our favorite kind of movie or any of those kinds of things. It just does whatever it does. All right. Des questions?